Hello and welcome back. Have you ever had a feeling about someone? You meet them and something just feels off. You can't explain it, you just know. And then 5 minutes later, your mind supplies the explanation. They're lying. They don't like me. Something is wrong. I shouldn't trust this person. Maybe you're right. But here's the interesting question. What if you weren't wrong about what you perceived, but you're wrong about what you thought it meant? Those are two very different things. And I think we get ourselves into trouble because we collapse them into one experience. We perceive something, we interpret it, and then we experience our interpretation as though it were the original perception. So I want to untangle those three things today. Let's say you walk into a room and immediately feel uncomfortable. That's the first thing. You noticed something. Maybe you can't even identify what it was, but your body registered something before you consciously knew what you noticed. That's perception. Okay, good. That's the baseline. But then comes interpretation. There's something wrong with this person. And then the conclusion, I shouldn't be here. Three different events. But subjectively, they can happen so quickly that they feel like one. And that's where intuition gets complicated because intuition may actually be very good at detecting patterns. Your nervous system is taking in enormous amounts of information all the time. Tone of voice, facial expression, movement, timing, posture, context, something familiar that reminds you of something you've encountered before, micro expressions, things like that. Much of that processing happens before you consciously formulate an explanation. So you may genuinely notice something before you can tell yourself what you noticed. But then your conscious mind wants an answer. It hates an unfinished pattern. So it says, I know what this means. And that may be where you go wrong. I think this is one of the most useful distinctions we can make when working with intuition. The signal is not necessarily the story that you tell about the signal. Your stomach tightens. That's information. This person is dangerous. That's an interpretation. Your chest feels strange. That's an experience. Something terrible is about to happen. That's an interpretation. You suddenly think of someone you haven't thought about in years. That's an event. And then you think, oh, they must be thinking of me. That's an interpretation. And notice what happens when we separate them. We don't have to dismiss the original experience, but we don't have to turn it into certainty. We can simply say, something happened. I noticed it. I don't know what it means yet. That is a very powerful place to stand. And it's where discernment comes in. Okay, so discernment isn't skepticism. And I want to make that really clear. It isn't saying, I can't prove this, therefore it isn't real. Okay, but it's not blind belief either. So both sides of those have an issue. The skeptics are saying, I don't believe anything until we can measure it. But sometimes things aren't measurable until far later. Take the earth is round. Well, it's probably not a good example. Let's take the sun moves around the earth, but the earth really moves around the sun, but we couldn't measure it until much later. Germs are another thing that we didn't have the measurement for, but they were there. Okay, skeptics would have discounted all of that, but blind belief has the same issue because you're saying, oh, I believe everything. Well, that's just as difficult and just as door closing as skepticism because you say, I created the story. That story is the end. There's no exploration past this story. Okay. So this is the ability to hold an observation without immediately forcing it into a conclusion. So you might say, something about this feels familiar. Okay, stay there. Don't immediately turn it into, this person is exactly like my ex-husband, or this situation is exactly like when I was bullied when I was a child. That's your brain doing what brains do. It's looking for a pattern and it's completing it. But perhaps the person really is like your ex-husband, or perhaps the situation really is like when you were bullied as a child. Maybe they're not, though. The point is that the observation and the conclusion are different pieces of information. So here's where intuition gets really interesting. The answer isn't to distrust your intuition. In fact, I think that's another mistake. We hear so much about confirmation bias and projection and cognitive distortion that sometimes people learn to distrust their own perception completely. They feel something and immediately tell themselves, oh, I'm probably imagining it. That isn't discernment either. So that's simply another form of interpretation. Instead, what I want you to do, notice, record, separate, investigate, and then see what happens. That's a very different relationship with intuition. Okay, you're learning how signals appear for you specifically, not for me, not for your friend, for you. But you have to look at it over a period of time. And you're not saying my intuition is always right or my intuition is meaningless. You're saying my perception is information. Now let's find out what kind of information it is. That's much more interesting. And you can practice this. The next time you have a strong intuitive response, don't ask, what does this mean? Instead, ask, what did I notice? That's a harder question because your brain will immediately want to answer with the story. So slow it down. Break it into pieces. Maybe you say, my shoulders tightened. I suddenly wanted to leave. I noticed she stopped making eye contact. I had the image of a door. I felt a sudden sense of familiarity. I became very alert. Those are observations. Okay. Then ask, what am I adding to that? That's where you begin to find the interpretation. And then there's a third question. What else could I explain, or what else could explain what I noticed? Not because your first interpretation is necessarily wrong, but because one observation can support multiple hypotheses. Let me give you an example. You text someone, and they typically text you back very quickly, but a day goes by, and they haven't texted you back. And you immediately might say, oh, that last text I sent them was kind of short. Maybe they're mad at me. Maybe last time we were at lunch and I said that we should hurry up and finish because I had an appointment. They were offended. And you start creating this whole story about why they didn't text you back. But in reality, their phone was lost and they didn't get it back to the following day. Or they were on a vacation and they weren't looking at their phone. There's so many other reasons. Okay, but record it and see what you find. See what signal comes through for you. That's discernment. And this is where intuitive readings become interesting to me. When I use an intuitive reading, when I do an untangled session, I'm not handing someone a sentence and saying, this is your future. That's not interesting. I use the reading as another way of generating information and perspective. I may look at the larger arc of a person's year, and then we look at particular months. And if they have something significant coming up, decision, transition, event, we can look at those days. The reading draws on symbolic and astrological patterns with my own intuitive perception, but what emerges isn't the end of the inquiry. It's the beginning of another one. So what does this suggest? Does it resonate? Does it contradict what you thought? Does it reveal a pattern you hadn't considered? This is where these things become useful because, again, information is not the same thing as interpretation. And this is one of the great challenges of being human because humans want certainty. We want to know what things mean. We want the person to be good or bad, or the feeling to mean yes or no. We want the dream to mean this. We want the symptom to mean that. We want coincidence to mean something. We want the intuition to be a verdict. But perhaps intuition isn't designed to give us verdicts. Sometimes it's giving us something to look at. And that's a very different relationship with perception. So instead of asking, was my intuition right? We sometimes should ask, what exactly did I perceive and what did I add to it? That's a much more sophisticated question because you could discover that you were wrong about the story while being completely right about the fact you noticed something. And that's fascinating. So the next time you get a strong gut feeling, try this. First, what did I actually experience? Second, what meaning did I immediately assign to it? And third, what other explanations are possible? And then, and this is the hardest part, wait. Let reality give you more information. You don't have to decide immediately. You don't have to distrust yourself. You don't have to believe yourself either. You can simply remain curious because the goal isn't to become someone who believes every intuition, and it isn't to become someone who believes nothing. The goal, let me underscore this, is to become better at seeing. And that's where the real discernment begins. If this distinction, oh my goodness, is useful to you, I would love to hear how you experience it. Have you ever had that experience of realizing I wasn't wrong about what I noticed, but I was wrong about what I thought it meant? That's a different kind of mistake. And once you start noticing the difference, you may find yourself seeing your own intuition and yourself a little differently. Your intuition might be right, but your interpretation might be wrong. Next time, we're going to go deeper into this, and I'm going to start teaching you ways to amplify your discernment and understand your particular signals and how to interpret them. This helps you use your intuition for your greatest good. Stay tuned and like and follow.